The small town of Redemption Creek wasn't much to look at. Just a dusty main street with wooden buildings on either side, a church with a crooked steeple, and folks who worked hard from sunup to sundown. But in this rough frontier town, everyone knew that Rose Washington was special. Rose wasn't just the only black woman in Redemption Creek. She was the only person who knew how to help mothers when their time came. Her healing hands had brought more than 50 babies safely into the world over the years. Even folks who turned their noses up at her in the street came knocking on her door when someone they loved was sick or hurt. "Mornin', Miss Rose," called out old Mr. Jenkins from his rocking chair outside the general store. He tipped his hat as she walked by, her medicine bag swinging lightly at her side. "Morning to you two," she replied with a small smile. Rose had just helped deliver little Thomas Baker, the mayor's new son, after a long night's work. Her back ached something fierce, but there was pride in her tired eyes. Another life safely brought into the world. The October air had a bite to it as the sun started to set. Rose pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders, thinking only of the hot tea waiting for her at home. She didn't notice the 3 riders watching her from the shadows near the blacksmith's shop. These men weren't from around Redemption Creek. They were part of the Blackwell Gang, outlaws known for robbery, cattle rustling, and worse across 3 territories. They'd been hiding out in the hills after their last job went bad, and they needed money fast. "That's her," whispered the tallest one, a man with a scar running down his cheek. "Heard the mayor paid her real good for delivering his baby, and she's got no man to protect her." His brother, a heavy-set man with yellowing teeth, grinned. "She'll fetch a nice ransom too. Mayor seems fond of her." The third man, younger than the others, shifted nervously in his saddle. "I don't know about this, Ezra. Kidnapping's different from stealing cattle." "Shut your mouth, boy," Ezra hissed. "You want your share or not?" Rose turned down the narrow path that led to her small cabin at the edge of town. The sun had almost disappeared now, and the path was dark with long shadows from the pine trees. She was thinking about which herbs to use for Mrs. Wilson's cough when rough hands suddenly grabbed her from behind. A dirty hand clamped over her mouth before she could scream. Rose kicked and fought hard, her medicine bag falling to the ground, bottles breaking and spilling precious medicines into the dirt. "Stop fighting unless you want to get hurt," a harsh voice growled in her ear. Rose bit down hard on the hand covering her mouth. The man yelped and cursed, then something hard hit the back of her head. The world spun and went dark. When she woke, she was bouncing face down across a horse, her hands tied tight behind her back. Her head throbbed and the taste of blood was in her mouth. Through blurry eyes, she could see they were riding through thick forest, far from the town lights. "She's awake," one of the men said. Rough hands pulled her upright. Rose found herself staring into Ezra Blackwell's cold eyes. "You caused us trouble, woman, but you'll bring us good money, so you get to live, for now." Rose said nothing, but her eyes burned with quiet fury. She may have been afraid, but she wasn't broken. Back in Redemption Creek, dawn broke with people starting their daily work. It wasn't until Mrs. Wilson came looking for her cough medicine that anyone realized something was wrong. They found Rose's medicine bag on the path, its contents scattered and trampled. Sheriff Wade Thompson bent down slowly, picking up a small torn piece of fabric caught on a thorn bush. His weathered face turned grim as he recognized the pattern from Rose's shawl. "Get my horse," he told his deputy, "and send someone to fetch Jack Bell from his cabin." The deputy looked confused. "The old trapper? What for?" Sheriff Thompson's eyes narrowed as he looked toward the distant mountains. "Because Jack Bell is the only man who might know where they've taken her. And God help those fools when he finds out what they've done." Nobody in town knew the whole truth about Jack Bell, that he had another name in another life. A name that made hardened outlaws shake with fear. The Blackwell Gang had just made the worst mistake of their lives. They'd taken someone precious from the most dangerous man in the West. The midday sun beat down on Redemption Creek, but the mood in town was darker than a storm cloud. 2 days had passed since Rose Washington's kidnapping, and folks were starting to lose hope. Sheriff Thompson had organized search parties, but the Blackwell Gang knew these mountains well. They had vanished like smoke. The town was quiet when the stranger rode in. He came from the east, a tall figure on a coal-black horse that moved with the silent grace of a mountain cat. Dust coated his long black coat, and his hat was pulled low, shadowing his face. But it was the way people stepped aside as he passed that told the real story. Even those who didn't recognize him could sense something dangerous in the air. He tied his horse outside the saloon and stepped through the swinging doors. The usual chatter died as heads turned. The bartender, Hank, nearly dropped the glass he was polishing. "Sweet mercy," Hank whispered. "Jack Bell." The stranger moved to the bar, his spurs making the only sound in the room. His movements were calm but watchful, like a wolf among sheep. Up close, people could see his face now, weathered by sun and wind, with eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. A thin scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into the collar of his shirt. "Whiskey," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner. Hank hurried to pour the drink with shaking hands. "On the house, Mr. Bell." The stranger, Jack Bell, didn't reply. He took the glass and turned, leaning against the bar as he surveyed the room. Everyone avoided his gaze except old Pete Wilson in the corner. "Figured you'd show up eventually," Pete said, his voice creaky with age. "Heard about Rose, did you?" Jack's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his glass. "What about her?" The room grew even quieter, if that was possible. Pete took a swig of his beer before answering. "Blackwell gang took her. 2 nights back." For a moment, Jack didn't move. Then he drained his whiskey in one swallow and set the glass down gently on the bar. Too gently. The calm in his movements scared folks more than anger would have. "Where's Thompson?" he asked. "Sheriff's office," someone offered. Without another word, Jack walked out, leaving the saloon in whispers behind him. Sheriff Wade Thompson was studying a map when his office door opened. He looked up, and the color drained from his face. "Bell, didn't expect to see you." "Talk," Jack said simply, removing his gloves one finger at a time. The sheriff rubbed his gray mustache nervously. "They took her heading northwest, near as we can figure. Found tracks by Rattlesnake Creek before losing them in the rocks. 3 men, maybe 4. Jack moved to the map, his finger tracing the likely route. "Blackwell, that'd be Ezra and his brothers." "Most likely. They've been causing trouble across the territory. Robbed the bank in Silverdale last month." Jack studied the map for another minute, memorizing the terrain. "They'll head for the Broken Skull Mountains. Plenty of old mining camps to hide in." "How do you know that?" Sheriff Thompson asked. Jack's eyes, cold as winter frost, met the sheriff's. "Because that's where I'd go." The sheriff swallowed hard. Everyone knew the stories about Jack Bell, though few knew if they were true. Some said he killed 20 men in a shootout in Dodge City. Others claimed he'd hunted down an entire gang of murderers who'd killed a family in Kansas. What they all agreed on was that he was the most feared gunslinger in 3 territories. "Look, Bell," Thompson said carefully, "Rose is well liked here. We want her back safe." "I've got men ready to ride." "They'll slow me down." "Maybe so, but you don't know what you're walking into. Could be an ambush." A ghost of a smile touched Jack's lips, there and gone so fast you might have imagined it. "They're the ones walking into an ambush. They just don't know it yet." Something in his voice made the sheriff's skin crawl. "What's she to you anyway?" Thompson asked. "Far as anyone knows, you two never spoke much when you lived here." Jack turned away, looking out the window at the town. For a moment, a different expression crossed his face, something softer, almost vulnerable. "We were children together," he said quietly. "Before the war. Before everything changed." He seemed about to say more, then shook his head. "I'll leave at first light. Anyone who wants to come better, be ready to ride hard and follow orders." As Jack walked toward the door, Sheriff Thompson called after him, "Those Blackwell boys, you planning to bring them in alive?" Jack paused, his hand on the doorknob. He didn't turn around when he answered. "That depends on how they've treated her." The door closed behind him, and Sheriff Thompson let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out his old army revolver. If they were going after the Blackwell gang with Jack Bell, they were going to need all the firepower they could get. Outside, the townsfolk watched from windows and doorways as the man in black made his way toward the boarding house. Those who remembered him from 15 years ago struggled to match this dangerous stranger with the quiet boy who'd left town after burying his family. But Rose would have recognized him instantly. She was the only one who knew the real Jack Bell, the boy who'd once picked wildflowers for her birthday, long before he became the shadow that brought death. Dawn broke cold and gray over Redemption Creek. Jack Bell was already mounted on his black horse when Sheriff Thompson and 3 volunteers rode up to meet him. The sheriff had managed to convince only a handful of men to join the search: 2 brothers who ran the livery stable, Tom and Will Hayes, and a young deputy named Caleb who was too green to know better. "This all?" Jack asked, eyeing the small group. Sheriff Thompson nodded. "Most folks are scared of the Blackwells. Can't say I blame them." Jack checked his guns, a pair of Colt revolvers worn smooth from years of use. "We ride hard. Anyone who can't keep up turns back." Without waiting for a response, he nudged his horse forward, heading northwest toward the distant mountains. The others scrambled to follow. By midday, they had reached Rattlesnake Creek, where the last tracks had been found. Jack dismounted, kneeling to study the ground. His fingers touched the dirt, feeling the impression left by horses days before. 3 riders, he said. 1 horse carrying double. That'd be Rose. Young Deputy Caleb looked impressed. "How can you tell all that just by looking at some old tracks?" Jack didn't answer. He was already moving along the creek bed, reading signs invisible to the others. Where the sheriff's search party had lost the trail at a stretch of rocky ground, Jack barely slowed down. He pointed to a barely visible scrape on a boulder. "Horseshoes scraped here. They went up this way." Sheriff Thompson shook his head in wonder. "Where'd you learn to track like that?" Jack's face remained expressionless. "Spent 2 years with a crow hunting party up in Montana Territory. Then 3 more tracking Apache raiders for the Army." The Hayes brothers exchanged nervous glances. The stories about Jack Bell kept growing. They rode higher into the hills, the trail becoming steeper and the air cooler. Jack led them off the main paths, following game trails that wound through thick pine forests. By late afternoon, they crossed a ridge and looked down into a small hidden valley. "There," Jack said, pointing to thin wisps of smoke rising from trees about 2 miles distant. "That'll be them." Sheriff Thompson squinted. "How can you be sure? Could be trappers or prospectors." "Blackwell isn't stupid enough to make camp where he could be spotted from the main trails, but he's lazy. Too lazy to go without a fire even when he's running." Jack's voice had a cold certainty to it. "And he doesn't know he's being hunted. Not yet." They made their own camp a mile away, in a sheltered spot where their fire wouldn't be seen. The night grew bitter cold as the men huddled around the small flames, eating jerky and hard biscuits. Jack sat slightly apart, cleaning his guns with slow, deliberate movements. The way he handled those weapons made Deputy Caleb stare. It wasn't just practice, it was like watching a preacher handle holy things. Each part cleaned, oiled, and checked with complete focus. "You really going after all 3 of them by yourself?" Will Hayes finally asked, breaking the silence. Jack didn't look up from his work. 4 of them. There's a lookout posted on the North Ridge." Sheriff Thompson frowned. "How do you know?" "We didn't see anyone." "Saw fresh cigarette butts under that big pine. Man's been sitting watch." Jack reassembled his second gun with quick, sure movements. Poor discipline. Smoking on lookout duty. The men fell silent again, each lost in their own thoughts. The younger Hayes brother finally worked up the courage to ask the question they'd all been wondering. "Is it true what they say? That you gunned down the entire Sutton gang after they robbed that train in Kansas?" For a long moment, it seemed Jack wouldn't answer. Then, without looking up, 6 men, not a gang, just drifters who thought robbing a train would be easy money. "And you killed all 6? Caleb asked, eyes wide. Jack's hands paused on his gun. "They shot a young woman who was just trying to protect her little brother. Left her to bleed out on the floor." His voice was flat, emotionless, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "So yes, all 6. The camp fell silent again, the only sound the soft click of Jack's guns as he finished his work. The Hayes brothers shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very aware of who they were sitting with. Sheriff Thompson cleared his throat. "What's the plan for tomorrow?" "I go in alone. Circle around before first light. Take the lookout first, then work my way to their camp." "And us?" the sheriff asked. "You stay back. If shooting starts, you come in fast from the east. But I'll handle it." Thompson shook his head. "That's not how a posse works, Belle. We stick together." Jack finally looked up, his eyes reflecting the firelight like a wolf's. "This isn't a posse, it's a hunting party, and I'm the hunter." No one argued with him after that. As the others settled down to sleep, Jack moved away from the camp, finding a spot where he could look out over the dark valley. Somewhere down there, Rose was being held by men who wouldn't hesitate to hurt her if it served their purpose. His hand tightened on his gun belt. The cold night wind carried the scent of pine and distant snow. Jack's mind drifted back 15 years to another night when he'd failed to protect people he cared about. His family's farm burning. His father's body on the porch. His mother and sister. He pushed the memories away. That was another life. Before he became what he was now. Morning would come soon. And with it, the Blackwell gang would learn what it meant to take something from Jack Bell. The stars were still bright in the sky when Jack Bell slipped away from camp. He moved like water through the trees, making no more sound than a shadow. Years of tracking both animals and men had taught him how to become invisible in the wilderness. The air was bitter cold, his breath forming small clouds. Jack pulled his black scarf higher around his face and continued his careful approach toward the lookout's position. The sentry was exactly where Jack expected, perched on a rocky outcrop with a good view of the trail below. In the pale moonlight, Jack could see the man was young, probably the newest member of the Blackwell gang. He sat with his back against a pine tree, rifle across his lap, fighting to stay awake after a long night's watch. Jack circled around, coming up from behind. The young outlaw never heard him approach. One moment he was alone, struggling to keep his eyes open, and the next a strong arm wrapped around his throat while a hand covered his mouth. "Make a sound, and it's your last," Jack whispered in his ear. "Nod if you understand." The terrified lookout nodded quickly. "How many in your camp?" "4, the young man stammered when Jack eased the pressure on his mouth. "Ezra and Lem Blackwell, plus me and Hank Dixon." "And the woman?" "She's there. Tied up but alive. Please, mister, I didn't want no part in taking her. That was Ezra's idea." Jack's grip tightened slightly. "But you went along with it." "I didn't have a choice. You don't say no to Ezra Blackwell." "You made your choice when you joined them," Jack said quietly. "Now you've got one more choice to make. Tell me everything about their camp, and I'll let you live." The young outlaw talked fast, telling Jack about the layout of the camp, where Rose was being kept, and where each man slept. When he finished, Jack hit him hard behind the ear with the butt of his gun. The lookout crumpled to the ground, unconscious but alive. Jack tied him securely to the tree and continued toward the main camp. Dawn was just breaking when he reached the edge of the small clearing where the Blackwell gang had made their camp. 3 bedrolls were arranged around a dying fire. A lean-to shelter had been built against a large boulder, and inside, Jack could see Rose's form. Her hands were tied in front of her, and she sat with her back straight, dignity intact despite her situation. Jack studied the scene carefully. Ezra Blackwell was the biggest threat. A mean-spirited killer who always slept with a gun under his pillow. His brother Lem was slower, but just as dangerous when cornered. The third man, Hank Dixon, was a known knife fighter with quick hands. As Jack watched, planning his approach, Rose suddenly looked up and directly toward the trees where he was hidden. For a moment, he thought she had somehow sensed his presence. Then he realized she was simply watching the sunrise, finding comfort in its beauty despite her circumstances. The sight of her face, bruised but unbowed, stirred something in Jack's chest that he'd thought long dead. He remembered a young girl who had once shown him kindness when others turned away. Who had helped tend his father's wounds after a bar fight? Who had never looked at him with fear, even after he returned from the war with blood on his hands? Jack's grip tightened on his knife. The original plan had been to wait until they were all awake, to create a distraction and pick them off one by one. But seeing Rose's bruised face changed everything. He couldn't wait. Moving silently, Jack approached the closest sleeping form, Hank Dixon. The knife fighter never woke as Jack's blade slid across his throat. A quick, clean death, more merciful than the man deserved. Jack melted back into the trees, circling around to approach from a different direction. But as he moved, a dry branch snapped under his boot. Ezra Blackwell was instantly awake, gun in hand. "Who's there?" he called out, eyes scanning the trees. His shout woke his brother Lem, who scrambled for his own weapon. "It's nothing," Lem said. "Probably just a deer." Ezra wasn't convinced. He stood, gun ready, turning slowly. Check on Tucker. He should have been back from lookout by now. Lem grumbled but headed up the trail toward the lookout post. Ezra continued scanning the trees, his face tense. "You feeling jumpy, Ezra?" Rose called from her shelter, her voice surprisingly steady. "Maybe your conscience is finally catching up to you." "Shut your mouth," Ezra snarled. He walked over and roughly pulled her to her feet. "You're more trouble than you're worth." "You have no idea," Rose said, looking him directly in the eye. "Death follows men like you." Something in her tone made Ezra nervous. He dragged her out of the shelter, using her as a shield while he continued to search the surrounding forest. From his hiding place, Jack watched, recalculating his approach. With Rose in danger, he needed to be more careful. Ezra was smart, smarter than most outlaws Jack had hunted. He sensed the danger even if he couldn't see it. Suddenly, Lem came crashing back through the underbrush, his face pale with fear. "Tucker's dead. Someone cut his throat." Ezra's face went hard. "Get the horses. We're leaving now." "What about Hank?" Lem asked, then froze as he spotted his friend's body by the fire. "Oh God." "Grab what you can carry and mount up," Ezra ordered, dragging Rose toward the horses. "Someone's hunting us." Rose's eyes searched the trees, hope replacing fear on her face. Somehow she knew who was out there. As Ezra roughly shoved her toward his horse, she stumbled deliberately, buying a few precious seconds. In that moment, a single shot rang out from the trees. Ezra howled in pain as the bullet struck his shoulder, causing him to release his grip on Rose. She immediately dropped to the ground, rolling away from him. "It's him," Lem screamed, firing wildly into the forest. "It's the shadow." Ezra grabbed his wounded shoulder, his face contorted with rage and fear. Who's out there?" Rose looked up at him from the ground, a small smile on her lips. "I told you. Death follows men like you." She looked toward the trees. "And he's come for you at last." Chaos erupted in the Blackwell camp. Ezra fired blindly into the trees while dragging Rose back toward the shelter. Lem ran for the horses, then dove for cover behind a fallen log as another shot kicked up dirt at his feet. "Who's out there?" Ezra bellowed, his wounded shoulder bleeding through his shirt. "Show yourself." Only silence answered him. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Even the birds had gone quiet. Rose struggled against Ezra's grip, but he twisted her arm painfully behind her back. "Stop fighting, or I'll break it," he hissed. From his position in the trees, Jack watched and waited. He had 2 more men to deal with, but now they were alert and desperate. Worse, Ezra was using Rose as a shield. Jack needed to be patient, to wait for the right moment. Sheriff Thompson and his men heard the gunshots from their camp a mile away. "That's our signal," the sheriff said, grabbing his rifle. "Let's move." But Deputy Caleb, who'd been keeping watch, pointed toward the trail. "Riders coming. Looks like the 3rd Blackwell brother and some others." The sheriff cursed under his breath. Must be the rest of their gang. Bell didn't know about them. He turned to the Hayes brothers. "Change of plans. We need to hold these newcomers off. Bell's on his own for now." Back at the outlaw camp, Ezra had dragged Rose into the old mining shack they'd been using as shelter. The small wooden structure had just one door and a single window with broken glass. Ezra positioned himself against the back wall, gun pointed at the entrance. "Lem," he shouted, "get in here." His brother crawled slowly toward the shack, keeping low. A bullet splintered the wood near his head, making him yelp in fear. "I can't," Lem cried. "He'll pick me off." "Then keep him busy. Shoot at where the shots are coming from." Lem fired several rounds into the trees, but hit nothing. Jack had already changed positions, moving like a ghost through the underbrush. Inside the shack, Ezra pressed his gun against Rose's temple. "Whoever's out there," he called, "I've got the woman. You want her alive, you'll back off and let us ride out of here." For a long moment, there was no response. Then a calm voice carried across the clearing. "Let her go, Ezra. This is between you and me." Ezra's eyes widened in recognition. "Bell? Jack Bell? Is that you out there?" "It's me." A nervous laugh escaped Ezra's lips. Well, The famous gunslinger himself. Never thought I'd have the honor. His voice hardened. But you're not so scary now, are you? Not with me holding your lady friend here. Rose's eyes flashed with anger, but she remained still, watching, waiting. You've got nowhere to go, Jack's voice replied, seeming to come from a different direction now. Your lookout is down. Hank Dixon is dead. It's just you and your brother now. And we've got her, Ezra shouted back. So here's how this works. You throw your guns into the clearing where I can see them, then back away. Once we're clear, we'll let her go in the next town. You're lying. Jack's voice was flat, certain. Try me. You got 1 minute to drop those guns or I put a bullet in her. Inside the shack, Rose felt Ezra's hand trembling slightly against her head. The man was scared, desperate. That made him unpredictable. She needed to help Jack somehow to give him an opening. Her eyes scanned the small space, noticing a loose board near her foot. Carefully, she shifted her weight, testing if she could move without Ezra noticing. Outside, Lem had managed to reach a better position behind a large rock. You hear that, Belle? He shouted. You ain't got no choice. Jack's voice came again, this time from directly behind the rock where Len was hiding. There's always a choice. Lem spun around in terror, but saw nothing. In his panic, he exposed himself for just a second too long. A single shot rang out, and Lem fell, clutching his chest. Lem! Ezra shouted from the shack. Seeing his brother fall pushed him over the edge. That's it, Belle. You're dead. You and this woman both. He raised his gun to fire at Rose, but she was ready. Her foot shot out, kicking the loose floorboard hard. It cracked upward, striking Ezra's wounded shoulder. He howled in pain, his shot going wild into the ceiling. Rose threw herself to the floor as Ezra struggled to aim again. But before he could pull the trigger, the window shattered completely as Jack fired through it. The bullet caught Ezra in the gun arm, making him drop his weapon. It's over, Blackwell, Jack called. Send Rose out, and maybe you'll live to stand trial. Ezra looked around frantically, trapped and wounded. But then a slow, cruel smile spread across his face as he reached into his boot and pulled out a small derringer. Not yet it ain't, he muttered. Outside, Jack had moved to the edge of the clearing, ready to rush the shack if needed. The silence from inside worried him. Rose, he called. Can you hear me? No answer came. Jack tightened his grip on his gun, preparing to move in. Then the door of the shack creaked open slowly. Rose stood in the doorway, her hands still bound in front of her, blood splattered across her dress. Jack, she said softly. He started toward her, relief flooding through him. But something in her eyes made him stop. He's behind me, she whispered. He's got a gun to my back. Ezra's voice came from behind her. That's right, Belle. Now drop that fancy six-shooter or I put a hole in her spine. Jack stood perfectly still, his mind racing through options. He could take the shot. He was fast enough, accurate enough. But if Ezra's finger twitched as he fell... I'm waiting, Belle, Ezra growled. Drop it now. Jack slowly bent to place his gun on the ground. The other one too, Ezra demanded. Jack reached for his second revolver. As he did, his eyes met Rose's. Something passed between them, a look, a memory, a plan. Rose suddenly stumbled forward, as if losing her balance. It was just a small movement, but it was enough. For a split second, Ezra's gun moved away from her back as he tried to grab her. In that moment, Jack drew his second gun with lightning speed and fired. The sound echoed through the clearing like thunder. Rose dropped to her knees as Ezra stood frozen behind her, a look of surprise on his face. Then he toppled backward into the shack. Jack rushed forward, pulling Rose away from the doorway and checking her for injuries. Are you hurt? Did he? I'm all right, she said, her voice shaking but strong. I'm all right, Jack. He quickly cut the ropes binding her wrists. As they fell away, Rose did something that surprised him. She reached up and touched his face gently, as if making sure he was real. You came for me, she whispered. Jack nodded, unable to find words. For 15 years, he'd been a ghost, a shadow, a name that made men afraid. But in her eyes, he was still just Jack, the boy who had once been her friend. The moment was broken by the sound of distant gunfire. Jack turned sharply toward the sound. That'll be the sheriff. Sounds like they've run into trouble. Rose stood straighter, rubbing her raw wrists. Then we better go help them. Jack looked at her with new respect. After everything she'd been through, she was ready to face more danger to help others. "Just like old times," he said with the ghost of a smile. Rose picked up one of the fallen outlaw's guns. Just like old times. Jack and Rose moved quickly through the forest, following the sounds of gunfire. Rose kept pace despite her exhaustion, her face set with determination. Jack had given her Lem's pistol, which she carried with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. "My pa taught me to shoot when I was 12, she explained, seeing Jack's questioning look. "Said a woman on her own needs to know how to protect herself." Jack nodded. "Smart man." The gunfire grew louder as they approached a ridge overlooking a small canyon. Below, they could see Sheriff Thompson and his men pinned behind rocks, exchanging shots with a larger group of riders. "Looks like the rest of the Blackwell gang showed up," Jack said grimly. "Must be Pete Blackwell leading them, the oldest brother." Rose studied the scene with narrowed eyes. "The sheriff and his men are outnumbered." "Not for long." Jack moved along the ridge, finding a position that overlooked the outlaws below. Rose followed, staying low to avoid being seen. From their vantage point, they could count 6 riders firing at the sheriff's position. "Pete Blackwell's the one with the gray hat," Jack said quietly. "He's the brains of the family. More dangerous than Ezra in his own way." "What's the plan?" Rose asked. Jack checked his ammunition. "I'll work my way down and come at them from behind. You stay here where it's safe." Rose gave him a look that would have wilted a lesser man. "I didn't come this far to hide on a hill, Jack Bell." A ghost of a smile crossed Jack's face. "Didn't think you would." "All right then. You see that boulder to the left of the sheriff's position? Think you can make it there without being seen?" Rose nodded confidently. "Good. When you get there, let Thompson know I'm circling around. When you hear my first shot, all of you lay down cover fire. Keep their heads down while I move in closer." "Be careful," Rose said, touching his arm briefly before moving away. Jack watched her go, admiring her courage. Then he began his own approach, working his way silently down the rocky slope toward the outlaw's position. Rose reached the sheriff without being spotted. Thompson's face showed shock and relief when she appeared beside him. "Miss Rose, thank the Lord you're alive. Where's Bell?" "Circling around," she explained quickly. "He says to provide cover fire when he makes his move." The sheriff nodded, then noticed the gun in her hand. "You know how to use that." Rose checked the chamber with practiced ease. "Better than you might think, Sheriff." Deputy Caleb, crouched nearby with a bleeding arm, whistled softly. "Remind me never to get on your bad side, Miss Rose." The outlaws continued firing, unaware of the trap about to spring. Pete Blackwell shouted orders to his men, trying to flank the sheriff's position. "They're getting bold," Thompson muttered. "Won't be long before they rush us." "Jack will make his move soon," Rose assured him. As if summoned by her words, a single shot rang out from the rocks behind the outlaws. One of Pete's men cried out and fell from his horse. "Now," Sheriff Thompson shouted, standing to fire over their cover. Rose and the others joined in, sending a barrage of bullets toward the suddenly confused outlaws. Caught between 2 fires, the men scattered for cover, no longer organized. Jack moved like a shadow from rock to rock, each shot finding its mark. 2 more outlaws fell before the rest realized what was happening. "It's Bell," one of them shouted in panic. "The shadow's here." Pete Blackwell's face contorted with rage. "Stand your ground, you cowards." He bellowed, firing wildly in Jack's direction. But his men were already breaking. One turned his horse and galloped away, only to be knocked from the saddle by the Hayes brothers' well-aimed shots. Jack emerged from behind a boulder, both guns drawn, walking steadily toward Pete Blackwell, who now stood alone. "This ends now, Pete," Jack called. "Throw down your gun." Pete's eyes were cold with hate. "You killed my brothers." They made their choice when they took Rose. For a moment, it seemed Pete might surrender. He lowered his gun slightly, his shoulders slumping. Then, with a sudden motion, he raised his weapon to fire. Jack was faster. 2 shots rang out almost as one, and Pete Blackwell staggered backward, his gun unfired. He looked down in surprise at the red stains spreading across his chest, then fell face first into the dust. Silence fell over the canyon. the last echoes of gunfire faded away, replaced by the soft moan of wind through the rocks. Jack stood over Pete's body, his face unreadable. He felt nothing, no triumph, no regret, just the familiar emptiness that came after violence. Rose approached slowly, followed by Sheriff Thompson and his men. She placed a gentle hand on Jack's arm, drawing his attention back from whatever dark place his mind had gone. "It's over," she said softly. Jack holstered his guns with a weary nod. "It's over." The ride back to town was quiet. They'd brought the bodies of the Blackwell brothers tied across spare horses. The few gang members who had survived were bound and placed under the watchful eyes of Deputy Caleb and the Hayes brothers. Rose rode beside Jack, her face showing the exhaustion of her ordeal. But there was strength there too, and a determination that had seen her through the darkest moments. As they crested the final hill overlooking Redemption Creek, the setting sun painted the small town golden. It looked peaceful, ordinary, a haven of civilization in the wild country. "Never thought I'd see this place again," Jack said quietly, so only Rose could hear. "Never thought I'd be so happy to see it," she replied with a small smile. Sheriff Thompson rode up beside them. "Town's going to want to thank you properly, Belle. You're a hero to these folks now." Jack shook his head slightly. "I'm no hero, Sheriff." "You are to me," Rose said, her eyes meeting his. In that moment, something changed between them, a connection reforged through fire and blood, stronger than before. As they rode down toward the waiting town, Jack Bell, the man they called the Shadow, felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest, something he'd thought long dead. Hope. Word spread fast in Redemption Creek. By the time Jack, Rose, and the sheriff's party rode down the main street, folks were already lining the boardwalks. They watched in silence as the dead outlaws passed by, then broke into cheers at the sight of Rose, alive and sitting tall in her saddle despite everything she'd been through. Old Mrs. Wilson pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "Rose, thank the heavens." Rose smiled tiredly and dismounted, accepting the older woman's fierce hug. Others surged forward. Patients she had helped, mothers whose babies she had delivered, neighbors who had feared the worst. Their relief was genuine, their welcome warm. Jack hung back, watching from horseback. This wasn't his moment. He'd done what he came to do. Rose was safe. The Blackwells were finished. Now it was time to move on, as he always did. But as he turned his horse to leave, Sheriff Thompson caught his reins. "Not so fast," Bell the sheriff said. "Town's going to want to thank you proper." Jack shook his head. "I didn't do it for thanks." "Did it for her, didn't you?" Thompson nodded toward Rose, who was now looking back at them through the crowd, concern crossing her face as she saw Jack preparing to leave. Before Jack could answer, Mayor Baker pushed through the throng. Unlike most, he didn't look entirely pleased to see the infamous gunslinger in his town. "Sheriff, I see the rescue was successful," the mayor said, pointedly addressing Thompson rather than Jack. "We're all grateful to have Miss Rose back safely." "You can thank Bell for that," Thompson replied. "Without him, we'd never have found her." The mayor cast a nervous glance at Jack. "Yes, well, we're certainly appreciative. The town will pay whatever reward is appropriate." Jack's face hardened. "I didn't come for money." An uncomfortable silence fell over the gathering. Everyone knew Jack Bell's reputation, the deadly gunman, the cold-eyed killer who had brought down some of the most dangerous outlaws in the territory. Having such a man in their midst stirred a mixture of gratitude and fear. Rose stepped forward, breaking the tension. "Jack saved my life," she said clearly, her voice carrying to everyone. "And not just mine. He stopped men who would have gone on hurting others." The mayor cleared his throat. "Be that as it may, Miss Rose, Mr. Bell's profession isn't exactly welcome in a peaceful town like ours." Several townspeople shifted uncomfortably. Jack had expected this reaction. It was the same everywhere he went. People were happy to have him solve their problems, then eager to see him leave before he caused new ones. "I'll be moving on," Jack said quietly. "Just need supplies." But Rose wasn't having it. She stood straighter, her eyes flashing with the same determination that had helped her survive her captivity. "This man was born in this town," she said firmly. "His family is buried in our cemetery. If he's not welcome here, then neither am I." A murmur ran through the crowd. Rose Washington was respected, needed. No one wanted to lose her. "Now, Rose," Mayor Baker began, "no one's saying." "That's exactly what you're saying," Rose interrupted. "You want the man who kills the wolves, but you don't want him living among the sheep. Well, sometimes the sheep need to remember that without the wolf at their door, they'd be helpless when real danger comes." Jack had never heard Rose speak so boldly. The quiet healer he remembered had grown into a woman of remarkable strength. The standoff might have continued, but old Pete Wilson stepped forward. He was the oldest resident of Redemption Creek, his beard white as snow and his back bent with age. "I remember when Jack Bell was just a boy," he said, his voice creaky but clear. "Remember when his folks were killed too? This town didn't do right by him then. Maybe it's time we made that right." Others began to nod, memories stirring. The blacksmith spoke up next. "My pa always said there was something wrong about how the Bell family was treated. Said some folks in town were too quick to believe bad talk about good people." Jack sat still as stone on his horse, unprepared for this turn of events. For 15 years he'd been alone, moving from place to place, his only connections forged in violence. The idea of staying anywhere, of being welcomed rather than just tolerated, was foreign to him. Rose moved to stand beside his horse, looking up at him. "You don't have to decide right now," she said softly. "But you should know there's a place for you here, if you want it." That night, a small celebration was held at the town hall. Rose was the guest of honor, but eyes kept drifting to the tall figure who stood by the door, uncomfortable with the attention yet unwilling to leave her side. As the evening wore on, Rose found a moment alone with Jack on the porch outside. "You're thinking of leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. Jack looked out at the dark street. "It's what I do." "It's what you've done," Rose corrected gently. "Doesn't mean it's what you have to keep doing." A long silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken things. Finally, Jack turned to her. "I've killed a lot of men, Rose." "Bad men," she replied. "Men who needed stopping. Does that make it right?" Rose considered this carefully. Maybe not right, but necessary. There's a difference between a man who kills because he has to and one who kills because he wants to. I've known both kinds. You're not the second. Jack looked down at his hands. Hands that had taken so many lives, yet had also just saved one that mattered. "What would I even do here?" he asked quietly. Rose smiled. "Live, Jack. Just live. The rest will follow." As they stood together in the cool night air, a rider came galloping down the main street, pulling up hard in front of the town hall. It was a telegraph messenger from the next town over. "Urgent news," he called out, drawing everyone's attention. "Frank Blackwell broke out of territorial prison 3 days ago. Killed 2 guards. Word is he's heading this way, swearing revenge for his brothers." A hush fell over the gathering. Frank Blackwell was the oldest and smartest of the brothers, imprisoned for a bank robbery that had left 3 people dead. He was said to be the cruelest of the family. All eyes turned to Jack. The unspoken question hung in the air. Would he stay and face this new threat, or take it as an excuse to move on? Jack met Rose's gaze. In her eyes, he saw not just concern but belief in him, in what he could be beyond the shadow of his reputation. "Looks like I'll be staying a while longer," he said simply. As word of his decision spread through the crowd, Jack Bell realized something he hadn't felt in 15 years. For the first time since he buried his family, he wasn't just passing through. He was coming home. And whatever came next, Frank Blackwell, old ghosts, or new beginnings, he wouldn't face it alone.